I am joined now by Washington-based aerospace expert Dr. Roger Myers, who has spent more than 30 years developing, testing, and flying space technologies for NASA, national security, and commercial space missions. You have been busy, and is now the proud owner of R. Myers Consulting, helping guide missions moving forward into space. Welcome, Roger.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I am ecstatic to talk with you today. We have a lot to unpack about the mission to space, but I think it's important to first maybe do a little bit of a history lesson. Of course, the first time humans landed on the moon was July 16th, 1969. That was Apollo 11. Moon exploration continued into the early 70s and then slowed in the late 70s. Why was that?
Budget, really, and the imperative to do it, the reasons to do it. We'd accomplished what we wanted to accomplish, which was to beat the Soviet Union to the, it was a geopolitical program primarily. Science, yes, but a lot of it was driven by geopolitics.
Interesting.
The United States and the Soviet Union each wanting to show the worth of their political systems.
And that's something we're going to unpack a little bit more of what that's going on again today.
Exactly.
We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But something you just said to me, which I think is so interesting, is the difference between what we did back then and what we're trying to do now is huge.
It's a completely different way of thinking about what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to go and have a sustained presence on the moon and actually go from not just do science on the moon, but also exploit the resources of the moon. So live off the land more on the moon.
And we were only there for 2 days.
We were there for 2 days before, and you know, we had a rover, and we lived in this little tiny hut. The ascent vehicle on the lunar excursion module. Was a very, very small vehicle. The astronauts would sleep in hammocks for 2 days. That was it. And now we're trying to stay on a sustained basis.
Inhabit.
And exactly, really be there for months and years at a time.
Wow.
We're trying to build to that capability to do that.
And I'm sure that's going to take a lot of work.
Exactly.
Who are some of the key players in this race? Because I know there's a lot of people doing it at once. And what does the actual timeline look like?
Well, so right now, the Artemis program, which is the NASA's Moon to Mars program, is using two different types of rockets. One is the Space Launch System, which you see now launching. And that's built by a consortium of companies. Boeing is a major player in building the SLS. But the lander, well, I should backtrack. The SLS only takes the Orion capsule, which is at the top of that and has the astronauts in it, to lunar orbit. It cannot land.
Okay.
When we went before, the Saturn V lifted a very small lander, and so it was one launch to get to the moon. One Saturn V could take astronauts to lunar orbit, land them on the moon, and bring them home. Because we're trying to do a lot more now with much bigger systems, and we're trying to take more people and more equipment, we can't do it with with one launch. So the SLS launch vehicle that you just saw taking off will take the astronauts to lunar orbit, and then a separate lander will rendezvous with them, will meet them in lunar orbit. They will move from Orion to the lander, and then they will land on the surface of the moon, do their surface mission, come back to Orion, and then Orion will bring them back to Earth.
Wow.
So NASA right now is preparing for the Artemis II mission, which is going to take 4 astronauts to lunar orbit. They will not land. The timeline for actually landing right now, the official timeline is in 2 years, 2027.
Is that overly ambitious?
Yes. There have been recent congressional hearings, and a lot has come out about the status of the landers. SLS is ready. SLS and Orion, they're fine. They will take astronauts to lunar orbit later in February, I think, is that mission, exactly. February of this coming year, American astronauts will be in lunar orbit again.
Wow.
But they won't land because the landers aren't ready. And the United States is using 2 landers, or pursuing 2 landers. One is a Starship base built by SpaceX, okay? And the other is Blue Moon, built by Blue Origin.
Okay.
Both of them are behind schedule. And both of them have a lot of work to do. They're very complex missions to get them to Earth orbit, refuel them in Earth orbit, which has never been done before, get to lunar orbit, rendezvous with Orion, have the crew transfer to Orion, to the lander from Orion, and then land on the moon and come back to Orion. So it's a very complex set of missions. And the reason they have to do it that way is because they're trying to do so much more than we did with Apollo, right? We're trying to have a sustained presence.
So if you could best guess with what we have right now, when will we be established on the moon?
I would say probably a couple years after 2029 probably we'll have our first landing again, 2028, 2029, so a year or two later than what NASA was hoping for.
Okay.
And that's really because of the lander development timeframes. I mean, I'm speculating, but I think that's a lot more likely than 2027.
But that's just landing. We're not even establishing yet.
Correct, exactly. To establish, we're going to have to land a lot of cargo. We're going to have to land habitats. We're going to have to land a lot of equipment.
Yep.
We're going to have to land a power system.
And that's what I want to talk about, the power. That seems to be one of the biggest issues and solutions being discussed, is actually putting a nuclear power plant on the moon. How in the world, or out of the world, are we going to do this?
So it turns out that the key to doing this is, one, it's a very small nuclear power plant. It's not a big power plant like you see on, that powers our grids. So these are very small. They're like the reactor itself is like the size of your washing machine. And then the overall system, it's got a big radiator. It's got a lot of equipment that goes to generate the power, transmit the power to the habitat or to whatever equipment it's trying to power. But the important thing is that we're not talking about a big reactor. We're talking about small reactors. And there's a lot of work right now dedicated to making sure they're safe, affordable, and small enough to fit on a rocket and land on the surface of the moon. And I think that we can do that by 2030.
Wow.
With a focused effort, if we think it's important to do as a nation to establish a sustained presence on the moon, and that's a question for policymakers and for the government to answer. But if we think it is important, with a focused effort, we could do it by 2030.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
I want to talk about something very complex. It feels simple at face value, but it is very complex. Who governs space? Why is there this big push to get there right now? And what does that do with whose land it is?
Right. It's a great question. And to be honest, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the answers. There are a lot of legal questions. The Outer Space Treaty, which the United States signed, and is signed by most countries in the world, says that nobody can own property in space. So all celestial bodies are common property. But many countries have now recognized that you can own resources extracted from celestial bodies. So you can go to the moon, and while you can't own the moon, you can't own property on the moon, if you extract oxygen or water or helium-3 or whatever resource, you can own that. So one of the big questions that we have today is, how are those resources distributed on the surface of the moon?
Yep.
And if somebody goes and establishes de facto control, they may not own it, but they still control it. And so if resources are concentrated in ways that allow a sovereign nation to control them, they control those resources. And other nations won't have necessarily access to them. A nation might grant them access, but once you control that space, you control it. You can establish a safety zone around it, or you can essentially dictate how people can access that region of those resources. And so a lot of this is driven by uncertainty in where the resources are on the moon. There's a lot of interest today in the south pole of the moon, because they're permanently shadowed regions of the moon where water ice is believed, with very high confidence, we believe that there's a lot of water ice in the south pole of the moon, in the craters, the permanently darkened craters of the moon. So establishing control over that would give us access to water, and water, you can make oxygen, you can make hydrogen, you can drink the water, you can use it for agriculture, water is really foundational.
For life.
Exactly, and for establishing a sustained presence on the surface of the moon. And then there are other resources also. I mean, there's a company, Interloon, is going to get helium-3 from the surface of the moon, and it's a local Puget Sound company.
That's incredible. Roger,
sorry,
we are
lots
out of time.
to talk about.
I think we could sit and talk for hours, but unfortunately, the clock is ticking.
All good.
Thank you so much for your
pleasure.
expertise. This is going to be fascinating to watch through the next few years and decades.
It
I
will be
appreciate your
exciting.
insight.